Entire lives can change in ways that are almost invisible at first. Not through dramatic breakthroughs, not through sudden bursts of motivation, but through something far quieter, a single decision repeated every day. Continue or stop. Look closely at any remarkable life, a successful entrepreneur, a world-class athlete, a brilliant writer, a calm and disciplined thinker. From the outside, their achievements may look extraordinary, but if you trace their story backward, something surprising begins to appear. Their lives were not shaped by one dramatic moment. They were shaped by thousands of ordinary days, days that looked almost identical, days when progress felt slow, days when motivation quietly disappeared. And yet, something important happened on those days. They continued. Imagine a training facility before sunrise. The lights are dim, the room is silent. Outside, the world is still asleep. Inside, one person begins their routine. No cameras, no applause, no recognition, just repetition. A movement practiced again, a skill refined one more time, a decision quietly made to continue. A coach who worked with Olympic athletes once described this moment perfectly. He said the hardest part of building champions was never the competition. It wasn't the pressure of performing, and it wasn't the physical pain either. The hardest part was the endless number of mornings that looked exactly the same. The mornings nobody saw, because greatness rarely grows in exciting moments. It grows in repetition. This is where something interesting happens in the human mind. When actions repeat long enough, the brain begins to treat them as normal. At first, discipline feels forced. Continuing requires effort. Stopping always feels easier. But over time, repetition changes something deeper. The brain adapts. The behavior becomes familiar. And slowly, something subtle begins to shift. Consistency stops feeling like effort. It starts feeling like identity. And identity is powerful. Because once something becomes part of who you are, it no longer requires constant motivation. It becomes automatic. A writer writes, an athlete trains, a disciplined mind continues. Not because every day feels exciting, but because continuing has quietly become normal. What makes consistency so fascinating is how unimpressive it appears in the moment. One workout rarely changes a body. One day of studying does not create mastery. One page does not turn someone into an author. On any single day, the progress can feel almost invisible. But when those small actions repeat across months and years, something extraordinary begins to happen. Skills compound, confidence stabilizes, focus deepens, and the person who once struggled to stay consistent begins to look completely different. Calmer, stronger, more capable. Not because they discovered a secret, but because they quietly repeated the same small behaviors long enough for them to transform everything. Over time, this creates a silent divide between two kinds of lives. One life constantly restarting, new plans, new goals, new bursts of motivation that fade just as quickly. The other life moving forward steadily, not dramatically, not loudly, but consistently. And after enough years, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. This quiet pattern appears again and again in the lives of people who achieve remarkable things. Not endless inspiration, not perfect motivation, but the discipline of continuing when stopping would have been easier. Consistency, the quiet advantage of powerful minds. In this audiobook, we will explore the deeper psychology behind this quiet force, why the human brain naturally resists consistency, why motivation alone rarely produces lasting change, and how those who master consistency slowly build an advantage that compounds across years. Because once the true power of consistency becomes clear, life stops feeling like a series of restarts and begins to feel like steady progress in one direction. A direction shaped by small actions that never stop repeating. When that quiet force may be the difference between a life that constantly resets and a life that continuously rises. Chapter 1. The Hidden Cost of Inconsistency. A strange pattern quietly repeats itself in countless lives. A person begins something with excitement, a new routine, a new goal, a promise to finally become more disciplined. For a while, everything feels different. Energy is high, the plan feels clear, progress seems close. Then something small interrupts the rhythm. A busy week, a stressful day, a moment of exhaustion. One missed day appears harmless. But what many people underestimate is how powerful a single break in rhythm can be. Because the true danger of inconsistency is not the missed day itself. The real danger is what happens inside the mind after that moment. Inconsistency quietly resets momentum. Every time a routine breaks, the mind must start the process again. And starting is always the hardest part. Starting requires effort. Starting requires energy. Starting requires the brain to fight resistance all over again. That is why beginning something often feels exciting, but maintaining it feels difficult. The human brain is wired to resist repeated effort. It prefers novelty. It prefers comfort. It prefers immediate rewards. Consistency offers none of those things at first. Instead, it asks for repetition, and repetition can feel painfully ordinary. Consider the experience of learning any new skill. The first few days feel inspiring. The progress feels visible. Each small improvement creates motivation. But after a few weeks, something changes. Progress slows down. The excitement fades. The routine begins to feel predictable. At this exact moment, many people stop. Not because they lack discipline, not because they lack intelligence, but because the mind begins to whisper something dangerous. This isn't working. That whisper is responsible for countless abandoned goals. Yet the truth is often the opposite. Progress was beginning to compound. But the routine ended before the compounding effect had time to occur. A musician once described the difference between amateurs and professionals in a surprisingly simple way. Amateurs practice when they feel inspired. Professionals practice even when inspiration is nowhere to be found. Over time, this difference becomes enormous. The amateur experiences bursts of progress, followed by long periods of stagnation. The professional experiences slow progress that never stops. After enough time passes, the gap between them becomes impossible to close. And the reason is not talent, it is continuity. And the hidden cost of inconsistency is not just slower progress, it is the psychological damage created by repeated restarts. Each time a routine collapses, something subtle happens inside the mind. Confidence weakens. The brain begins to associate effort with failure. A quiet belief begins to form. Maybe I'm just not the kind of person who sticks with things. That belief becomes incredibly powerful, because once identity is involved, behavior begins to follow it. If someone begins to see themselves as inconsistent, the mind unconsciously protects that identity. New routines are approached with less conviction. Goals feel less believable. Effort becomes hesitant. In this way, inconsistency slowly erodes self-trust. And self-trust is one of the most powerful psychological resources a person can possess. Consistency, on the other hand, builds the opposite effect. Each repeated action strengthens a different belief. I am someone who continues. That belief may begin quietly. One day of discipline, then another, then a week, then a month. With each repetition, the mind collects evidence. Evidence that effort leads somewhere. Evidence that progress is possible. Evidence that stopping is no longer the default response to difficulty. And over time, this evidence becomes identity. There is another hidden cost of inconsistency that few people talk about. Inconsistent effort prevents the brain from entering deep learning. Mastery requires familiarity. Skills grow through repetition. When actions repeat often enough, the brain begins to optimize them. Neural pathways strengthen. Movements become smoother. Thinking becomes faster. Patterns become easier to recognize. But this process only occurs when repetition is uninterrupted. When practice stops frequently, the brain must constantly rebuild the pathway. It is like trying to walk across a field where the path disappears every few steps. Each time the grass grows back, the journey begins again. This is why consistency creates such a powerful advantage over time. Not because each individual effort is extraordinary, but because the effort never resets. The path remains clear. Momentum continues to grow, and the person who simply continues walking eventually travels much farther than someone who repeatedly turns around. Life rarely rewards bursts of effort. Life rewards continuity. Small actions repeated long enough begin to reshape reality. A page written every day becomes a book. A skill practiced daily becomes mastery. A disciplined routine repeated for years becomes a completely different life. But none of these transformations are visible at the beginning. They appear only after consistency has been maintained long enough to reveal its quiet power. And that is why inconsistency is so dangerous. It interrupts the very process that creates extraordinary results. Before the transformation has time to appear, the routine disappears, the effort resets, and the journey quietly begins again from the starting line. Understanding this hidden cost is the first step toward mastering consistency. Because once you realize what inconsistency truly steals from you, momentum, identity, and progress, you begin to see every small action differently. A single day no longer feels insignificant. A single repetition no longer feels trivial. Each one becomes a building block in something much larger, something that only reveals itself to those who continue long enough to see it. And that realization leads to an important question. If inconsistency is so costly, why does the human mind resist consistency so strongly? To answer that question, we must look deeper into the psychology of the brain itself. Chapter 2. Why the human brain resists. Consistency. Consistency sounds simple in theory. Repeat a useful action every day, and over time the results begin to multiply. Write a little every day, and eventually there is a book. Practice a skill daily, and eventually there is mastery. Exercise consistently, and eventually the body becomes stronger. Yet despite how simple the formula appears, maintaining consistency is surprisingly difficult. Not because people lack intelligence, not because people lack ambition, but because the human brain was never designed to love repetition. In fact, in many ways, the brain quietly resists it. The brain evolved with one primary goal: survival. To achieve that goal, it constantly looks for ways to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary effort. Every decision the brain makes is influenced by this simple question: is this worth the energy? This is why the mind naturally prefers activities that provide immediate rewards: pleasure, comfort, novelty, quick results. Consistency rarely offers any of those things at the beginning. Instead, it asks the brain to repeat an action even when the reward is far away, and the brain finds that deeply uncomfortable. Consider what happens when someone begins a new habit. The first few days can feel exciting. The brain releases dopamine because something new is happening. The novelty creates motivation. But novelty fades quickly. Once the action becomes familiar, the dopamine response decreases. Suddenly, the same routine that felt exciting a week ago begins to feel ordinary. And ordinary things rarely excite the brain. At this moment, a resistance appears. Thoughts begin to form. Maybe I'll skip today. I'll do it tomorrow. Missing one day won't matter. This is the brain attempting to return to comfort. But something fascinating happens when consistency continues beyond this uncomfortable stage. The brain begins to adapt. Repetition strengthens neural pathways. The action becomes easier. What once required effort begins to feel natural. At first, discipline is required to act. Later, the action begins to feel automatic. This process is known as habit formation, but it goes deeper than simple habits. It changes how the brain perceives effort. A person who consistently exercises no longer debates whether to exercise. The routine becomes normal. Skipping it begins to feel unusual. The consistency slowly rewires the brain's definition of normal behavior. This is why the early stages of consistency are always the hardest. The brain has not yet adapted. Every action still feels like effort. The mind constantly searches for excuses to stop. But if the action repeats long enough, the brain begins to shift. What once required discipline becomes routine, and what once felt difficult becomes familiar. The person who once struggled to stay consistent begins to feel uncomfortable when they are not. There is another reason the brain resists consistency. Human attention is naturally drawn toward novelty. New experiences activate curiosity. New ideas stimulate the mind. But repetition feels predictable. Predictable experiences feel less stimulating. This is why many people constantly chase new systems, new strategies, new routines. A new plan feels exciting. It creates the illusion of progress, but constantly changing plans can become another form of inconsistency. Because mastery rarely comes from constantly starting new things. It comes from staying with the same process long enough for it to work. Think about someone learning a musical instrument. The first weeks are exciting. New chords, new sounds, new progress, but eventually, practice becomes repetitive. The same scales, the same movements, the same drills repeated again and again. At this stage, many beginners stop. The repetition feels dull, but musicians who continue through this stage eventually experience something extraordinary. The repetition begins to unlock deeper ability. Movements become fluid, sounds become richer, expression becomes possible, and what once felt boring becomes the foundation of mastery. Consistency is not exciting in the short term. Its power reveals itself only over time, and that delay is exactly why the brain struggles with it. The mind wants visible rewards quickly. Consistency asks for patience. The mind wants novelty. Consistency requires repetition. The mind wants comfort. Consistency demands effort. In many ways, consistency requires a person to move against several natural tendencies of the brain, and that is why it is rare. But the rarity of consistency is exactly what makes it powerful. Because when most people stop at the stage where repetition becomes boring, those who continue quietly move ahead. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily. And steady progress accumulates. Days become months. Months become years. Small improvements begin to compound. The skill deepens. The discipline strengthens. The person becomes different. The most interesting part of this process is that it rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Day to day, the change is almost invisible. But after enough time passes, the difference becomes undeniable. Someone who consistently reads for years develops a powerful mind. Someone who consistently trains develops strength and resilience. Someone who consistently practices a craft develops mastery. None of these transformations come from bursts of effort. They come from repeated action. Understanding the brain's resistance to consistency reveals something important. The struggle to stay consistent is not a personal weakness. It is a natural psychological response. Everyone experiences it. Even the most disciplined individuals once felt the same resistance. The difference is not that they avoided the struggle. The difference is that they continued anyway. And that decision, repeated enough times, changed the structure of their behavior. The brain eventually adapted. Consistency became identity. Once that shift happens, something powerful occurs. The person no longer depends on motivation. They no longer wait for inspiration. They simply continue. And in a world where inconsistency is common, the simple act of continuing becomes an extraordinary advantage. But there is still one illusion that prevents many people from reaching that stage. An illusion that convinces the mind that motivation alone is enough. And that illusion is what we will explore next. Chapter 3. The dangerous illusion of motivation. Motivation feels powerful. When it appears, everything suddenly seems possible. Energy rises, focus sharpens, plans become clear. In moments of strong motivation, people imagine a completely different future. They see themselves becoming disciplined, productive, and unstoppable. But motivation has one critical weakness. It never stays for long. Motivation behaves like a spark. It ignites quickly, burns brightly for a short moment, and then fades. This is why many goals begin with enthusiasm, but end with silence. At the beginning of any new pursuit, motivation creates momentum. The first days feel exciting, the effort feels easy. Even difficult tasks feel manageable because the mind is energized by possibility. But motivation is an emotional state, and emotional states constantly change. Because stress appears, fatigue builds, doubt emerges. Suddenly, the same tasks that felt inspiring yesterday begin to feel heavy. And when motivation disappears, many people stop. Not because they stopped caring, but because they believed motivation would carry them further than it actually could. This is the dangerous illusion of motivation. It convinces people that success depends on feeling inspired, but the truth is much simpler. Motivation helps you start. Consistency helps you finish. Consider the experience of learning any difficult skill. In the beginning, excitement fuels the effort. The mind imagines rapid progress, but eventually the learning curve slows. Improvement becomes less visible. The excitement fades. At this stage, motivation alone is no longer enough. The person must rely on something deeper. Routine, discipline, non-consistency. Those who rely only on motivation stop here. Those who continue beyond this stage begin to experience real progress. Many successful individuals understand this difference very clearly. A writer once described his process in a way that surprised many people. He said writing a book had nothing to do with inspiration. Instead, he followed a simple rule. Write every day. Some days the words flowed easily. Other days the sentences felt slow and awkward. But the rule never changed. Write anyway. Over time, this simple routine produced something extraordinary. Not just one book, but many. The secret was not bursts of motivation. It was continuity. The same principle appears in nearly every field. Athletes train even when their bodies feel tired. Musicians practice even when progress feels slow. Entrepreneurs continue working even when results are uncertain. Their success does not come from constant excitement. It comes from the ability to continue when excitement disappears, and that ability separates temporary effort from lasting achievement. Motivation can still play a useful role. It often provides the first push. It helps people begin something new. Without motivation, many journeys would never start. But motivation should never be trusted as the main source of progress. Because motivation is unpredictable. Some days it appears strongly. Other days it disappears completely. If progress depends on motivation, progress becomes inconsistent, and inconsistency prevents the compounding effect that leads to mastery. Consistency solves this problem by removing emotion from the decision. Instead of asking, "Do I feel motivated today?" the question becomes much simpler. Is this what I do today? The answer becomes automatic. Writers write, athletes train, students study, disciplined minds continue. Not because every day feels exciting, but because the routine has become part of their identity. This shift from motivation to identity changes everything. When behavior depends on emotion, it fluctuates. When behavior depends on identity, it stabilizes. Someone who says, "I want to write a book," may write when motivation appears. But someone who says, "I'm a writer," behaves differently. Writing becomes part of who they are. And actions connected to identity are far more stable than actions connected to emotion. This is why consistency often feels powerful in hindsight. Looking back, it appears almost magical. Years of small effort produce remarkable results. But from the inside, the process rarely feels dramatic. It simply feels like continuing. Day after day, routine after routine, small step after small step, until one day the accumulation of effort becomes impossible to ignore. The illusion of motivation keeps many people from reaching this stage. They wait for the perfect emotional state. They wait to feel ready. They wait for inspiration to return. But those who build extraordinary lives rarely wait. They continue even when motivation is absent, because they understand something important. Motivation is temporary. Consistency is transformative, and once consistency replaces motivation as the driving force, something surprising happens. Progress becomes steady, confidence grows, identity strengthens. The person begins to trust themselves, not because they always feel inspired, but because they know they will continue regardless of how they feel. This is the quiet shift that transforms effort into mastery. And once this shift happens, something even more powerful begins to emerge. The small actions that once felt insignificant start to accumulate. Each repetition adds to the previous one. Momentum builds. Results begin to multiply, and slowly, the true power of consistency begins to reveal itself. The power of compounding effort. Chapter 4. The compounding power of small actions. At first glance, small actions seem insignificant. Reading 10 pages of a book does not feel life-changing. Practicing a skill for 20 minutes does not feel extraordinary. Writing a single paragraph does not feel like progress. In isolation, these actions appear almost meaningless. Yet something remarkable happens when these small actions repeat consistently over time. They begin to compound. The idea of compounding is often discussed in finance. Money invested consistently grows not only from the original amount, but from the accumulated growth that follows. Interest builds on top of interest. Over time, the growth becomes exponential, but the same principle applies to behavior. Small actions repeated daily begin to accumulate in ways that are difficult to notice in the beginning. A single workout may not transform the body, but hundreds of workouts quietly reshape it. 1 hour of learning may not create expertise, but thousands of hours eventually create mastery. The transformation is rarely visible in the early stages. It appears gradually, and then suddenly it becomes obvious. This delayed visibility is one of the reasons many people underestimate consistency. When progress feels invisible, the effort begins to feel pointless. The mind asks a dangerous question. Is this even working? Without immediate results, motivation weakens, doubt appears, and many routines disappear before the compounding effect has time to reveal itself. But those who continue eventually reach a point where the results begin to accelerate. Skills improve faster. Understanding deepens. Confidence grows. What once felt slow suddenly begins to feel powerful. Consider someone learning a new language. During the first month, progress feels painfully slow. Words are forgotten. Grammar feels confusing. Conversations feel awkward. It may feel as if nothing is improving. But after a year of consistent practice, something surprising happens. Understanding becomes easier. Words appear automatically. Sentences form naturally. The person who once struggled with basic phrases now communicates with confidence. The transformation did not happen in a single moment. It was built through thousands of small repetitions. The same pattern appears in physical training. A single workout does not produce dramatic results, but consistent training slowly changes the body. Strength increases, endurance grows, movements become smoother and more controlled. The body adapts to the repeated challenge, and eventually, what once felt difficult becomes normal. The transformation was never about one extraordinary effort. It was about repeated effort. One of the most powerful aspects of compounding effort is momentum. Momentum builds when actions repeat without interruption. Each repetition makes the next one slightly easier. A routine becomes familiar. The mind stops debating whether to act. Energy that once went toward decision-making is redirected toward progress. Momentum removes friction, and when friction disappears, consistency becomes easier to maintain. Inconsistent effort prevents this process from happening. Each time a routine breaks, momentum disappears. The brain must restart the habit. The resistance returns. What once felt natural begins to feel difficult again. It is like pushing a heavy wheel forward. At first, the wheel barely moves. Each push requires effort, but once the wheel begins rolling, the movement becomes smoother. Stopping the wheel means the next push must start the entire process again. Consistency keeps the wheel moving. Inconsistency forces the wheel to restart. This is why small actions are far more powerful than they appear. Individually, they seem insignificant, but collectively, they shape the direction of a life. A person who reads a little each day gradually develops a powerful mind. A person who practices a craft daily slowly becomes exceptional. A person who invests time in learning every day eventually possesses knowledge that others never develop. None of these outcomes come from dramatic effort. They come from quiet accumulation. What makes compounding so powerful is that its effects multiply over time. The first year of consistent effort produces noticeable improvement, but the 5th year produces transformation, the 10th year produces mastery, and by that stage, the gap between consistent individuals and inconsistent ones becomes enormous. Not because the consistent person worked harder every single day, but because they never stopped long enough for the progress to reset. This is the quiet secret behind many extraordinary lives. Behind every impressive skill, there are countless ordinary repetitions. Behind every successful career, there are years of daily effort. Behind every calm and disciplined mind, there are thousands of moments where continuing was chosen instead of stopping. The power of consistency lies not in intensity, but in accumulation. Small actions repeated long enough eventually become powerful forces. And once someone truly understands this principle, their perspective begins to change. A single day no longer feels insignificant. A single repetition no longer feels small. Each action becomes part of a much larger pattern. A pattern that, if maintained long enough, will inevitably produce results. But there is another transformation that occurs when consistency continues long enough. Something deeper than skill, something more powerful than momentum. Consistency does not only change what a person achieves, it begins to change who that person becomes. And then that transformation begins inside the mind itself. Chapter 5. How consistency rewires the mind. Consistency does something that most people never fully notice. It changes the brain. Not metaphorically, literally. Every repeated action slowly reshapes the structure of the mind itself. This process happens quietly, often without conscious awareness. Day by day, repetition strengthens certain pathways inside the brain while weakening others. Over time, behaviors that once required effort begin to feel automatic. What once felt like discipline begins to feel normal. This is why consistency is so powerful. It does not only improve results, it transforms identity. At the beginning of any new routine, the brain treats the action as unfamiliar. Unfamiliar actions require energy. The brain must concentrate. It must evaluate the situation. It must overcome resistance. This is why the early stages of discipline feel exhausting. A person trying to exercise regularly may debate every workout. A writer trying to write daily may struggle to begin each page. A student trying to study consistently may feel constant mental resistance. The brain is simply responding to something new. But the brain is also incredibly adaptable. With repetition, neural pathways begin to strengthen. Each repeated action sends signals through the same circuit. Over time, the brain learns the pattern. The action becomes easier. Not because the person has suddenly become more motivated, but because the brain has reorganized itself. Scientists call this process neuroplasticity. It is the brain's ability to reshape itself through experience. Every habit a person forms is essentially a network of strengthened neural connections. The more often a behavior is repeated, the stronger those connections become. And once those connections are strong enough, the behavior begins to feel natural. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. The first attempts feel unstable and awkward. Balance is difficult. Movements feel unnatural. But after enough repetition, riding a bicycle becomes effortless. The brain has built a reliable pathway. Consistency works in the same way with mental habits. Focus becomes easier. Discipline becomes automatic. Persistence becomes instinct. One of the most important transformations created by consistency is the shift from effort to identity. At first, A person says, "I am trying to exercise." Later, they say, "I exercise." At first, a person says, "I'm trying to write." Later, they say, "I am a writer." This shift may sound small, but psychologically, it is enormous. When a behavior becomes part of identity, it stops feeling optional. It becomes part of who a person is. And actions connected to identity are far more stable than actions connected to motivation. There is a powerful story often shared among long-distance runners. Many runners describe a moment when something changes in their relationship with running. In the beginning, every run requires motivation. The body feels heavy. The mind constantly suggests stopping. But after months of consistent training, the experience changes. Skipping a run begins to feel strange. Running becomes the natural state. The runner no longer asks whether they should run. They simply run. Consistency has rewired the behavior. This transformation does not happen suddenly. It happens slowly. Often so slowly that it is barely noticeable while it is occurring. 1 week of discipline feels difficult. 1 month begins to feel manageable. 6 months begins to feel natural. And after several years, the person often cannot imagine living differently. The behavior has become part of their identity. Consistency also reshapes confidence. Confidence is often misunderstood. Many people believe confidence appears before action, but in reality, confidence usually appears after repeated action. Each completed repetition becomes evidence. Evidence that effort leads somewhere. Evidence that persistence works. Evidence that a person can trust themselves. This accumulation of evidence strengthens self-trust. And self-trust is one of the most powerful psychological advantages a person can possess. Without consistency, self-trust weakens, and a routine begins, then stops. A plan is created, then abandoned. Over time, the brain begins to associate effort with disappointment. But with consistency, the opposite pattern develops. Each repetition confirms the same message. I continue. This simple message slowly builds a stable identity. An identity built on reliability, and reliability changes how a person approaches challenges. Difficult tasks no longer feel intimidating, because the person trusts that they will continue long enough to figure them out. There is another quiet change that consistency creates. It strengthens focus. The modern world constantly pulls attention in different directions. Notifications, distractions, endless information. Consistency trains the mind to return to the same task repeatedly. That repetition strengthens concentration. The brain learns how to ignore distractions. It learns how to stay with one process long enough to improve. And over time, this ability becomes a powerful advantage. A focused mind is capable of extraordinary work, but focus is rarely a natural gift. It is often the result of repeated discipline. Consistency is not simply about productivity. It is about transformation. Every repeated action shapes the brain. Every repeated behavior strengthens identity. Every repeated effort builds self-trust. Over time, these changes accumulate until the person who once struggled to stay consistent becomes someone who simply continues. And that shift is profound. Because once consistency becomes identity, progress no longer depends on emotion. It depends on who the person has become. This is why consistency is often described as a quiet advantage. It is not dramatic. It does not produce instant results, but it changes something deeper than temporary success. It changes the structure of the mind itself. And once the mind has been shaped by consistency, the person possesses something incredibly powerful. The ability to continue, even when progress feels slow, even when motivation disappears, even when challenges appear. Consistency makes persistence possible, and persistence over time creates extraordinary outcomes. But there is still one stage where consistency becomes truly powerful, a stage where the results begin to separate people dramatically. Because when consistency continues long enough, it produces something that cannot be replicated through bursts of effort. Momentum. And that is where the quiet advantage of consistent individuals becomes impossible to ignore. Chapter 6. The quiet advantage of consistent people. Consistency often goes unnoticed in the beginning. There are no dramatic moments when it first begins to work. No sudden transformation, no immediate recognition. Instead, consistency operates quietly beneath the surface, slowly widening the distance between those who continue and those who repeatedly restart. At first, the difference between these two paths appears small, almost invisible, but over time, the gap becomes enormous. Imagine two individuals who begin learning the same skill. Both start with similar enthusiasm. Both practice during the first weeks. Both believe they are capable of improvement, but their approaches slowly begin to diverge. One practices occasionally. They work intensely for short periods, then disappear for weeks. They restart many times, and each return feels like beginning again. The other person practices a little every day. Nothing extraordinary, just steady repetition. At the end of the first month, the difference between them is barely noticeable. But after a year, the contrast becomes clear. After several years, the gap becomes almost impossible to close. This is the quiet advantage of consistency. It does not create immediate superiority. Instead, it builds gradual separation. A small advantage appears. Then that advantage compounds. And eventually, what began as a small difference becomes a powerful lead. One of the most fascinating aspects of consistent individuals is that they rarely appear extraordinary at the beginning. In fact, many of them seem ordinary. They are not always the most talented. They are not always the fastest learners. They are not always the most confident, but they possess something that quietly changes the trajectory of their lives. They continue, day after day, week after week, year after year. And this continuation allows time to work in their favor. Time is the hidden partner of consistency. Without time, repetition produces little change. But when repetition continues long enough, time amplifies every action. Skills deepen, understanding grows, experience accumulates. What once required effort becomes effortless. And this transformation is difficult for inconsistent individuals to replicate, because inconsistent effort resets the clock. Every pause slows the process. Every restart delays progress. Meanwhile, consistent individuals continue moving forward. Consider the experience of someone learning a complex craft. At the beginning, every movement requires concentration. Mistakes are common. The process feels slow. But after years of repetition, something remarkable occurs. The same movements become fluid. Decisions become instinctive. The craft begins to feel natural. Observers may look at this person and assume talent is responsible. But what they are actually seeing is the accumulated effect of consistency. Thousands of hours of steady practice. Thousands of moments where continuing was chosen instead of stopping. This advantage becomes especially visible over long periods of time. 5 years of consistent effort produces noticeable improvement. 10 years produces mastery. 20 years produces authority. At that stage, the consistent individual often appears exceptional. But the foundation of that success was never extraordinary effort. It was sustained effort. This is why consistency often appears unfair. Someone who consistently develops a skill for years will eventually reach a level that others cannot easily match. Not because they worked harder every single day, but because they never stopped long enough for their progress to reset. Consistency protects momentum. Momentum protects growth. And growth compounds. There is another quiet advantage that consistent individuals develop. Clarity. Repetition allows deeper understanding to emerge. When someone returns to the same craft again and again, they begin to see patterns. They recognize mistakes more quickly. They notice subtle improvements. Their perception becomes sharper. This level of awareness cannot be developed through occasional effort. It only emerges through sustained engagement. Consistency allows the mind to stay close enough to a problem long enough to truly understand it. Over time, this combination of skill, experience, and clarity produces something powerful: authority. The consistent individual becomes someone others listen to, not because they claim expertise, but because their experience has refined their perspective. Years of repetition have taught them lessons that cannot be learned quickly. This quiet authority becomes another advantage created by consistency. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of consistency is how it changes the perception of difficulty. Tasks that once seemed overwhelming become manageable. Challenges that once caused frustration become opportunities for improvement, because the consistent individual has already faced similar obstacles many times before. Experience reduces uncertainty. Confidence grows, and what once felt impossible begins to feel familiar. From the outside, the life of a consistent individual may appear impressive, but from the inside, it rarely feels dramatic. It simply feels like continuing. Another day of practice, another repetition, another small step forward. Over time, those steps accumulate, and eventually, the quiet advantage becomes visible. The skill becomes undeniable. The progress becomes obvious. The transformation becomes clear. This is why consistency quietly separates those who achieve extraordinary results from those who remain stuck in cycles of restarting. Not because consistent individuals are always more talented, but because they allow time and repetition to work together. And when time and repetition combine, the results become powerful. Yet consistency does not reveal its full strength on easy days. Its real power appears during the hardest moments. When motivation disappears, when progress slows, when frustration begins to rise. Those are the moments when consistency is truly tested. And those moments determine whether momentum continues or disappears. Because the greatest challenge of consistency is not starting. It is continuing when continuing feels hardest. And that is where the true discipline of consistent individuals begins to appear. Chapter 7. Consistency on the hardest days. Consistency is easy on good days. When energy is high, routines feel natural. Motivation appears effortlessly. Tasks that once felt difficult suddenly feel manageable. On these days, discipline barely feels necessary. Progress seems simple. But the true test of consistency never happens on easy days. It happens on the difficult ones. The days when motivation disappears. The days when progress feels invisible. The days when stopping seems reasonable. Those are the moments that quietly shape a person's future. Every long journey eventually reaches a point where the excitement fades. At the beginning of any pursuit, energy comes naturally. The mind imagines success. The future feels promising. But as repetition continues, the emotional intensity begins to weaken, and what once felt inspiring begins to feel ordinary. This moment is where many routines end, because without excitement, effort suddenly feels heavier, and the mind begins to search for reasons to stop. These reasons often sound logical. I'm too tired today. I'll start again tomorrow. One day won't make a difference. At first glance, these thoughts appear harmless, but they carry a hidden risk. They slowly weaken the habit of continuation. Every time stopping becomes the response to discomfort, the brain learns that quitting is acceptable. And the next time difficulty appears, stopping becomes easier. Consistent individuals experience the same difficult days. They feel the same fatigue. They face the same doubts. The difference is not that they avoid these moments. The difference is how they respond to them. Like, instead of asking whether they feel motivated, they ask a different question. What is the smallest step I can take today? This question changes everything. Because consistency does not always require extraordinary effort. Sometimes it only requires continuation. A smaller workout, a shorter study session, a few pages written instead of many. The goal is not perfection. The goal is to protect the rhythm. Rhythm is one of the most powerful forces behind consistency. Once a routine begins repeating regularly, it creates a pattern in the mind. The brain begins to expect the action. Breaking the rhythm interrupts this pattern. Maintaining the rhythm keeps momentum alive. Even a small effort can preserve that momentum. And preserving momentum is often more important than achieving perfect performance. Many successful individuals follow a simple rule during difficult periods. Never allow a temporary obstacle to break the entire routine. A writer may produce only a few sentences on a difficult day. An athlete may complete a shorter training session. A student may review notes instead of studying intensely. These actions may appear small, but they serve an important purpose. They protect consistency, and protecting consistency protects progress. There is a powerful psychological effect created by maintaining routines during difficult days. It strengthens self-trust. Every time a person continues despite resistance, the brain receives evidence. Evidence that effort is reliable. Evidence that discipline is possible. Evidence that identity is stronger than temporary emotion. Over time, this evidence accumulates, and the person begins to trust themselves. They no longer depend on motivation to act. They depend on their own reliability. Self-trust is one of the most valuable advantages consistency can create. A person who trusts themselves approaches challenges differently. They do not panic when progress slows. They do not abandon goals at the first obstacle. They simply continue, because they know that continuing eventually produces results. This calm persistence often appears impressive from the outside, but from the inside, it simply feels normal. The person has practiced continuing so often that stopping feels unfamiliar. There is also a deeper transformation happening during difficult days. Resilience begins to grow. Each time a person continues despite discomfort, their tolerance for difficulty increases, and challenges that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. The mind becomes stronger. Patience develops. Frustration loses its power. Consistency slowly trains the mind to remain steady in the face of obstacles, and that steadiness becomes a powerful advantage in every area of life. Over time, difficult days begin to change meaning. Instead of seeing them as interruptions, consistent individuals begin to see them as opportunities. Opportunities to reinforce discipline, opportunities to strengthen identity, opportunities to prove that continuation does not depend on emotion. This shift in perspective transforms the experience of effort. The struggle itself becomes part of progress. It is important to understand that consistency does not mean perfection. Everyone experiences setbacks. Everyone misses days. What matters most is the response. A missed day does not destroy consistency, but abandoning the routine entirely does. The key is returning quickly. Returning restores momentum. Returning protects the pattern. Returning reminds the mind that continuation is the default response. Many people imagine that extraordinary results require extraordinary discipline every single day. But this belief is misleading. Extraordinary results usually come from ordinary discipline repeated for a long time, not dramatic effort, not perfect routines, just steady continuation. Even when the effort feels small, even when progress feels slow, even when the mind suggests stopping. Consistency on the hardest days is what ultimately separates temporary effort from lasting transformation. Easy days build momentum, but difficult days build character. They shape identity. They prove that progress does not depend on inspiration. It depends on persistence. And persistence, once developed, becomes one of the most powerful forces a person can possess. Eventually, something remarkable happens. The person who once struggled to stay consistent becomes someone who simply continues. Not because discipline suddenly became easy, but because continuation has become part of who they are. And when consistency becomes identity, the results begin to extend far beyond a single goal. It begins to reshape the entire direction of a life, which leads to the final transformation that consistency creates. Not just achievement, but becoming the kind of person who no longer breaks the chain. Chapter 8. Becoming the person who never breaks the chain. At the beginning of any journey, consistency feels like a strategy, a rule to follow, a system to maintain, something a person forces themselves to do in order to reach a goal. But over time, something deeper begins to happen. Consistency stops feeling like a technique. It becomes part of who you are. And when that shift occurs, everything changes. In the early stages, consistency requires discipline. The mind must push against resistance. It must overcome distraction. It must continue even when motivation disappears. But if the behavior repeats long enough, the effort begins to transform identity. Instead of saying, "I'm trying to be consistent," the person begins to think differently. "I'm someone who continues." This shift may seem subtle, but psychologically, it is powerful. Because actions connected to identity are far more stable than actions connected to goals. Goals are temporary. Once they are achieved, motivation can disappear, but identity remains. A person who identifies as a writer continues writing even after finishing a book. A person who identifies as an athlete continues training even after winning a competition. A person who identifies as disciplined continues improving even after reaching success. Consistency rooted in identity never truly ends. It becomes part of how a person lives. There is a simple concept often used by people who rely on consistent routines. It is sometimes called "never break the chain." The idea is simple. Every day you perform the behavior, the chain grows longer. One day becomes 2, 2 becomes 10, 10 becomes a month becomes a year. With each repetition, the chain becomes more valuable, because breaking it would mean losing the momentum that has been built. This simple visual idea creates powerful psychological pressure to continue. The longer the chain grows, the more natural continuation becomes. But the deeper purpose of the chain is not the streak itself. The real purpose is identity. Each repeated action reinforces the same message. This is who I am. A person who writes every day becomes someone who writes. A person who studies every day becomes someone who learns. A person who trains every day becomes someone who strengthens their body and mind. Over time, the behavior and the identity merge. The action is no longer something you force. It becomes something you naturally do. This transformation is what makes consistency such a powerful force. Because once identity is involved, the need for motivation disappears. You do not wait to feel ready. You act because the action reflects who you are. A disciplined person does not negotiate with themselves every morning. They simply follow the routine. Consistency removes the debate. And removing the debate removes friction. There is also another quiet advantage that appears at this stage. Freedom. At first, consistency may feel restrictive. A routine may feel like an obligation. But once the habit becomes identity, the routine begins to feel liberating. Because the person no longer wastes energy deciding what to do. The path becomes clear. Energy that once went into hesitation now goes into progress. Consistency simplifies life. Consider the difference between someone who constantly debates their actions and someone who follows a stable identity. The first person spends mental energy asking questions. Should I work today? Should I train today? Should I focus today? Each question creates friction. Each decision consumes attention. But a consistent individual has already answered those questions. The routine exists. The action continues. Energy is preserved. Focus deepens. Progress accelerates. Over time, this clarity creates remarkable results. Years of consistent effort produce skills that others struggle to develop. Disciplined thinking produces calm decision-making. Repeated practice produces mastery. Observers often see these outcomes and assume talent must be responsible. But talent alone rarely explains long-term excellence. More often, the explanation is simpler. Consistency allowed time to do its work. There is something quietly powerful about individuals who never break the chain. They develop patience. They develop resilience. They develop a sense of calm confidence. Because they know something others often forget. Progress is not created by sudden bursts of effort. It is created by repeated continuation. This understanding changes how challenges are perceived. When obstacles appear, consistent individuals do not panic, they simply continue. When progress slows, they continue. When motivation disappears, they continue. Because the identity of continuation has become stronger than the emotion of resistance. And this identity protects their momentum. Eventually, the results of this mindset become visible. A skill that once seemed impossible becomes natural. A goal that once seemed distant becomes reality. A life that once felt uncertain becomes steady and purposeful. Not because of dramatic changes, but because the person never stopped long enough for their progress to disappear. Consistency is often described as a quiet advantage, but its true power is deeper than that. Consistency is not just a tool for achieving goals. It is a way of shaping character. It builds patience, it builds discipline, it builds reliability, and those qualities extend far beyond any single pursuit. They influence every area of life. When a person becomes someone who never breaks the chain, something important happens. They stop chasing motivation. They stop waiting for perfect conditions. They stop restarting their progress every few months. Instead, they continue, day after day, year after year. Small actions repeated long enough begin to reshape the entire direction of a life. In the end, consistency reveals a simple truth. Extraordinary lives are rarely created through extraordinary moments. They are created through ordinary moments repeated with extraordinary persistence. And the people who understand this do not rely on inspiration. They rely on continuation, because they know that as long as the chain continues, progress will follow. At the beginning of this journey, we explored a simple idea: consistency, not as a motivational slogan, but as a quiet force that shapes the direction of a life. And along the way, something important began to appear. Success rarely comes from dramatic moments. It rarely arrives through sudden bursts of inspiration. Instead, it grows quietly, through repetition, through routines, through small actions that continue long after the excitement fades. We explored the hidden cost of inconsistency, how restarting again and again quietly destroys momentum, how the mind begins to lose trust in itself when effort repeatedly disappears, and how progress resets each time a routine collapses. Consistency protects something incredibly valuable: momentum. Without momentum, even the most ambitious plans struggle to survive. But with momentum, even small efforts can grow into extraordinary outcomes. We also looked deeper into the psychology of the brain. The mind naturally resists repetition. It prefers comfort. It prefers novelty. It prefers quick rewards. This is why consistency feels difficult at the beginning, not because something is wrong with you, but because you are working against natural resistance. Yet the brain is also capable of something remarkable. It adapts. Through repetition, neural pathways strengthen. What once required effort begins to feel natural, and slowly, consistency reshapes the mind itself. We explored the illusion of motivation, how motivation can help someone start, but rarely helps them continue. Motivation rises and falls. Emotions change. Energy fluctuates. But consistency does not depend on emotional states. It depends on identity. The moment a person begins to see themselves as someone who continues, discipline becomes far more stable. Action stops being a debate. It becomes a reflection of who they are. We also discovered the quiet power of small actions. On any single day, effort may feel insignificant. A few pages read, a short practice session, or a small improvement, but repetition allows these actions to compound. Days become months, months become years, and eventually the accumulation of effort produces something extraordinary. A skill, a career, a strong and focused mind, all built from small actions that refuse to disappear. We saw how consistency creates a quiet advantage, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Those who continue slowly separate themselves from those who repeatedly restart, not through talent alone, not through luck, but through time. Consistency allows time to become an ally, and time quietly multiplies every effort that continues. We also explored the hardest part of consistency, continuing when motivation disappears, continuing when progress feels slow, continuing on the days when stopping seems reasonable. These are the moments that shape identity, because each time a person continues despite resistance, they strengthen something powerful: self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. A person who trusts themselves no longer waits for perfect conditions. They know they will continue regardless of how they feel. Finally, we reach the deeper transformation that consistency creates: identity. At first, consistency is something a person tries to maintain, but over time, it becomes part of who they are. They become someone who writes, someone who trains, someone who learns, someone who continues. And when consistency becomes identity, progress becomes inevitable, because the chain no longer depends on motivation. It depends on character. The world often celebrates dramatic success stories, sudden breakthroughs, unexpected achievements. But if you look closely at the lives of those who truly build something meaningful, the pattern becomes clear. Behind every impressive result are thousands of quiet repetitions, days when no one was watching, moments when stopping would have been easier, decisions to continue that seemed small at the time. Yet those small decisions slowly built something powerful, a life shaped by persistence, and that is the quiet power of consistency. It does not need attention, it does not require dramatic effort, it simply requires continuation. One step, then another, and another, until the path becomes clear. If there is one idea to carry forward from this audiobook, it is this: you do not need extraordinary bursts of effort to change your life. You only need small actions that refuse to disappear, because when those actions repeat long enough, they begin to shape something deeper than success. They shape the kind of person you become. Someone who does not restart their progress every few months. Someone who does not depend on motivation to move forward. Someone who simply continues. And in a world where many people stop too soon, that quiet ability to continue may be the most powerful advantage of all. The quiet advantage of powerful minds.